when I talk to beginner beekeepers, I always tell them that they ask how many hives everybody asks me, how many hives do you have? And I'll say, I'm not sure, let me go count them. I only run about 15 or so hives. It goes up and it goes down, but that's kind of where I am. But I always tell beginner beekeepers that 2 is greater than 1. If you're going to start beekeeping, I really encourage you to start with at least 2 hives. If you start with only 1 hive, you're just really vulnerable. And just like it was mentioned earlier, if you lose your queen, if you've got 2 hives, you can pull eggs, a frame with eggs from 1 hive, put it in the other, and they will raise a new queen. Whereas if you only have 1 hive, you're going to be calling, you're going to be spending money to buy a queen, you're going to be in a panic. 2 hives gives you that benefit. Also, it's sort of a point of reference. If you look in your hive and go, I just started keeping bees, I don't know if what they're doing is right, if this is normal. Well, if you look in the other hive and they're doing the same thing, at least there's 2 hives you know of that are doing it. So I really encourage you to start with 2. It's going to benefit you in many, many ways as you go along. And I know people that don't, you have a small yard. When I first started keeping bees, I lived in East Nashville on Porter Road. If I had held on to that property for the last 20 years, I'd be a rich man. But it was just a little half-acre lot, and I kept a couple of hives in the backyard, but I didn't need 5 or 6 hives. That's not being a responsible neighbor, and that's not helping beekeeping when your neighbors are terrified to come by your house. But a couple of hives is okay for a residential area like that. And I understand if you don't want more than 2 hives, don't worry. When you have a swarm come up, there will be beekeepers that will take that off your hands if you're not ready to expand your operation. But getting started, number 1, we're going to talk about package bees, and that's really how I would bet most beekeepers are going to start with packages. I'm going to show you a video of how package bees are installed. We're going to talk about installing a nuke hive. We don't have any props here, but I'll describe it to the best of my ability. We're going to talk about collecting a swarm, which has already been touched on tonight, but I'll show you a little bit of that in action too, and then tell you how easy it really is. Let's start off with package bees and the pros of package bees. The positive things about using package bees is they're relatively inexpensive. They're cheaper than a nuke. It gives you an early start because package bees are produced further south typically. We're going to buy them out of Georgia. And even the folks like Johnson's Honey Farm, Wolf Creek Apiaries, they're making those splits, they're shaking those packages down further south, and then they bring them up here to distribute them. So it gives you a pretty early start to your beekeeping so that you're not going to miss the whole nectar flow when it hits in earnest. The cons of it, it's hard on bees. Imagine they literally shake these bees through a giant funnel into a box with screens on the side and ship them up here. The very best situation as far as package bees go, and Kelly's does it, as I mentioned, Wolf Creek does it, if you can either, if you can meet the truck basically. If you can go when package bees are being hauled in and get them right off the truck, because those things were packaged up the day before and they're not being shipped through the mail. You can buy bees through the mail with a package. It's not done very often anymore because it's so expensive. You'll pay almost as much for shipping as you will for the bees. And that is really hard on the bees because the Postal Service does their best, but they'll end up accidentally putting them on a loading dock and they'll get overheated. They might get exposed to some chemicals. They'll be they're very vulnerable at that point, and you're going to have some dead bees when you buy packages. The goal is to have as few dead bees as possible so those bees can get to work. And the thing to think about with package bees, when you install them, you've got a set population. But until that queen is able to start laying eggs and then those eggs go through their entire gestational period, you're not going to have any replacement workers. So your worker population is going to start dropping until it starts back up. So you want to start with as many bees as possible. So that results in a slow buildup as you're going into the spring. The nice thing for beginners about the Boardman feeder is if it's right outside your door, you come out, you can see instantly how much they've taken, how much they need. It's easy when you have a feeder that's inside the hive and you don't see it to say, oh, they probably have plenty. I'll get to them next weekend. and they'd be out of feed for a long time. And, you know, it's not likely that they're going to just starve to death, but it's going to really inhibit their ability to grow that colony and get going. So it's up to you, but you saw me put that feeder on the front of that hive. A simple approach to that is to take a little block of wood and put it next to the feeder. So if there was a robber bee coming, those feeders are kind of leaky, so there's going to be some stuff dripping, but if a robber bee came, it would have to go all the way around the block to get to it. You may find a situation where if you have two hives close together that they all decide, oh, we belong over here, because again, they don't identify with the queen anyway. I would say understand at the very minimum that regardless of how your hives are laid out, if you have 4 hives in a row, established hive I'm talking about, and the wind always blows this direction, guess which the strongest hive is going to be? Because when bees are coming in, if they're full of nectar, the guard bees don't care what hive they came from. It's like, back the truck up, come on in. So if the wind always blows this way, this is going to be the strongest hive. But that is something I've heard before, so that might be worth considering. Don't put them, you know, touching each other basically, but a couple of feet apart shouldn't be a problem under most circumstances. I would not discourage you. I've installed packages when it's snowing, okay, but I don't recommend it. But it's better to get them in a hive, you know, unless it's just gale force winds and sub-zero temperatures. It's better to get them in a hive and let them start doing their thing. So what I would say is if you get your packages and it's a really cold day in the 30s, don't wet them down like you saw me do, because the cold weather is going to achieve the goal of keeping them huddled together. But do as little as you have to as far as, so that would probably be a good day for the description I gave of just putting an empty box on top, opening the package up and setting it down in there and let them crawl out. So this again is the most common thing you're going to do. Feeding is very important. Let's talk about nuke hives a little bit. I'll do my best to describe it. I don't really have a video of installing a nuke. The good things about nukes, let me back up. What's a nuke? What's he talking about? Nucleus, the concept is instead of going and just buying a box full of bees like you do with a package, you're essentially getting a hive that's underway. You're just not getting all the bees in the hive. So a beekeeper that's raising queens is going to start her in a small hive. He's going to make sure that she's laying. And if he's selling packages, then he pulls her out and puts her in a cage. If he's selling nukes, he'll make more money from you, but you'll get a better start because he's going to sell you, it varies from producer, but 3 to 5, maybe 6 frames of bees. The queen is laying. They're already a family. There's brood, there's pollen stored, there's some honey stored, and there's lots of bees, and they're all living happily, and they're doing their thing. There's no, they don't have to build comb. They don't, to get going. You don't have to wait for the queen to lay eggs. It's already a miniature hive that you're buying. And the nice thing about that is it's a very quick buildup because all you do is you give them more foundation or more comb, and they just keep doing what they've already been doing. They've got a lot of practice at. The queen is proven. One complaint you'll hear is about queens. You'll get a package or you'll buy a queen, and it's like, oh, well, I don't think she was mated right, or I don't think, there's always 1,000 things that can go wrong when you're introducing a queen to a hive. With this, she's already laying. You can see the proof of her progeny right there on the frames. And I'll kind of give a plug for the local beekeepers like Johnson's Honey Farm. You go out to Robert Johnson, he's going to drag you out in the yard, and you're going to see. It's not like you just come pick a box up under most circumstances. When I've been out there, he says, hop in the truck, we'll go get your nuke. And he's going out there, and he'll show you the brood, he'll show you the queen, he'll put them in the box and send you on your way. And that's what a lot of beekeepers do, and that's a great way to get bees. The cons of nukes, they are more expensive. Perhaps it's worth it to you, though. They are harder to get. Raising bees and selling bees in Tennessee is a real challenge, and just in general, because think about it, you've got a product that a lot of people want and are willing to pay big money for. And you know how many orders you've got, and you know how many bees you'd like to produce. But if the weather's bad, if there's a lot of rain, if there's a late cold snap, it's going to affect your business in tremendous ways. And it's not like you're raising tomatoes and if you don't sell them, you can just throw them away. You've got to do something with all these bees. They're very, very valuable. So they are harder to get, and it requires a little bit of patience and maybe a little bit of negotiating. And again, you got to feed them. What's a nuke cost? $135 for a 5-frame, I think. Does anybody buy one this past year? $155, 5-frame, you reckon? It's going to vary by the number of bees you get, where they're coming from. But it's, you know, you're buying an established hive up and going. So a lot of people these days are gravitating toward, you know, maybe just using medium frames. Most nuke producers are going to sell you deeps. But don't freak out. You can just take 2 mediums and you'll have a little space at the bottom that those bees will build comb on. You'll have to clean it out, but you can get started. But you're getting 5 frames, for instance, of deep frames that you're going to put in your, for instance, 10-frame box. So you're going to have to add frames on the outside, put those in the center, add those to the outside, and then let them get started. Soon after that, go ahead and give them at least 1 super. And like Jake said, you might want to go ahead and give them a couple, 3. When nukes are building up, though, here's sort of the catch and the challenge of bees. It's not such a big deal in the spring when the wax moths and the hive beetles population is kind of low, but you want to be aware that if you give a small hive, a small colony, a big hive, they've got to patrol all that area. They've got to be able to control the pests that might give them trouble, like wax moths and hive beetles. So you don't want to overdo it as far as giving them space to work, but you don't want them to run out of space either. The biggest thing as far as, and it was mentioned about preventing swarming, just realize swarming is a natural thing. Bees want to do it. We can fight it all we want, but they're going to do whatever they can to swarm in the spring of the year. But if you give them lots of room, that's going to diminish that instinct to swarm. It's no shame in losing a swarm because it's the bee's instinct. The shame is if you lose a swarm because you just didn't get out there and super and give them enough room and they swarmed multiple times. And again, feed. You're going to have to feed these bees. Let's talk about swarms. This is fun. This is a lot of fun. I encourage everybody to try to find an opportunity to do it, and if you love it, you can get on the swarm list and get some free bees. The downside of swarms, you don't know anything about the genetics of those bees. I've caught some mean bees out catching swarms, and swarms in general are very gentle, so you don't know they're mean bees until you get them home in a couple days. Also, you don't know if they're healthy or not. You don't know if you're bringing some disease in. If you're going to catch a lot of swarms, you might even consider having a separate bee yard so that you can sort of quarantine those swarms until that queen starts laying and you know that they're going to be healthy. You know, because you would hate to have a bee yard full of bees and catch some free bees and inadvertently bring, an example would be American foul brood in and contaminate some more of your colonies, you know. You're going to have mites, you're going to have hive beetles. I'm not too worried about bringing those in, but you don't know about what health these bees have, and it's a good idea to kind of keep an eye on that. All right. Gene tells me to use different videos, but I didn't get around to it. He's seen this video about 100 times. That's the Frisk Center for Visual Arts downtown. They've got ornamental trees on their property. They called one day and said, hey, we got some bees. And so I immediately come over and climb up a ladder and start putting my face up there close to it, to impress people primarily. But if you'll put your hand up close to the swarm, you can immediately tell how they're going to respond to you. Swarms are very gentle, but you'll be surprised. People say, oh, those must have just arrived because, I would have noticed it. You'd be surprised how many people won't notice a swarm of bees. And you'll go up there to catch a swarm and there's comb under there where they've been there for a couple of weeks, But these bees, as I reached up here, they didn't go after my hand. They're very gentle. Your first few times catching swarms, please wear a veil at least. But what we did is we climbed up a ladder. The maintenance fella had bolt cutters, so I held on to the limb, and he cut the limb with the bolt cutter. I'm holding it tight so I don't shake a bunch of bees off, because we're just going to put them in a cardboard box. Now, when you're catching a swarm, whether it's a method like this, or a method I'll show you in a second. The ideal situation really is to put those bees in a nuke, for instance, and leave it there until dark, because those bees are sending out scouts. Just like the bees send out, foragers and they bring back nectar, those scouts are going to come back and do a little dance and help those bees decide where they're going to go. So when I put these in this box and carry them off, there's going to be scouts coming back. And I always tell people, well, those bees shouldn't give you any trouble, and they probably will go back to wherever they came from. That's probably a lie. Those bees are probably going to die, but it's not a whole lot of them. And I'm impatient, and I didn't want to hang out there all day. So I took those bees and went home. But the best thing to do is if you can put them in a box of some sort and have an opening and give those bees a chance to all come home at night and be in the box. And that way, when you come back, you carry them all off, and that neighborhood or that person's yard or wherever you got those bees, they're not going to have a bunch of random bees flying around, bothering people. And I tell people they are not going to bother you. They're not going to chase you around, but it does unnerve people when there's just bees that don't have a home wandering around. So occasionally you'll catch a swarm. You might even catch a swarm here, carry it to your house and set it up. And I've come out the next morning and the bees are hanging out on the outside of the hive in a clump. And that's a sign that they're still in swarm mode. And so occasionally you'll lose a swarm. But usually if you give them a nice place to live with comb to work, they'll want to stay. Some tricks to get them to stay would be, number one, you could just sort of lock them up in there, put a screen on the front so they can't get out and leave it for 24 hours. That's not really ideal because they need to start foraging and doing their thing. Another thing you can do, though, is instead of just putting them on foundation or comb, pull a frame with uncapped brood out of another hive. So they immediately smell brood that needs tending to. The nurse bees will start nursing and doing their thing and taking care of that brood, and it sort of triggers that instinct to, oh, we must be staying here because there's brood that we've got to take care of. They really hate to abandon brood. If you are patient, which I'm generally not, you can occasionally see the queen and catch her, and that's a really great thing to do for a couple of reasons. If you can get the queen, and I actually in the glove compartment of my car have a queen cage just for that. If you can see a queen, and might be a little more advanced beekeeping, but if you can catch her and put her in a cage, you're going to protect her so that she doesn't accidentally get squashed on the way home, with all the moving stuff around. And you can keep her in that cage for a day or two, and that might prevent that swarm from leaving. You don't have to do the candy thing like the queen producers do because that's her hive. You can just keep her in that cage for a day and then just go in there and pop the cork and just let it, and she'll crawl out and do her thing. What's interesting is when you stop using gloves, then you pay a lot more attention to what you're doing. You're a lot slower and calmer. You learn to feel bees, before you squash them with your hand. And the result is the bees stay calmer because you're focused, and it becomes instinct on not upsetting the bees by bumping and dropping and, that sort of thing. So once you develop some confidence, maybe you just take one glove off at first. But it does make a big difference in what you're able to do and how less clumsy you are. It's first come, first serve. And so if you wait until February, you're probably not going to get your bees till May. So I would recommend if you can get bees, early April is pretty safe around here to get bees. You can probably get them in March, but that's a little bit dicey. So it's first come, first serve when you're ordering packaged bees in Tennessee. So go ahead and get on the list. If you say, hey, maybe I'll order one more package than I really need, because you won't have any trouble selling it to somebody else. And if you change your mind about how many you want to have come spring. It depends on the producer. Some of them won't take orders until, say, January 1st. There's probably some that'll take them any time. And it varies by the producer, too, on whether they're going to want you to pay everything up front or 50% up front. Or, occasionally you'll find somebody that'll say, oh, you don't have to pay me because I'll sell everything regardless of whether you come get them. Most of them do want a deposit, though, because they don't want to have all those bees ready and then half their people don't show up that weekend to get them, because once they put them in the packages, they need to be installed. They can't just put them on the shelf for another week. They need to get them installed. And most beekeepers, like myself, are going to, Saturday's a great day to go pick up some packages. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, not so much. So they need to get them. They need to know when they put them in that package that they're going to be claimed and not be sitting around. I will say this: if you are late ordering bees, for instance, with Kelly's, they have their days in the spring. They truck them in on Saturdays. And sometimes if you just show up, there'll be somebody that doesn't show up. And even if a person has prepaid for bees, if they don't show up to pick up bees, they'll sell them to you, and then they'll deal with that person's account later because they just can't, put them on the shelf for a week. Here's the thing to understand about bees. Jake mentioned earlier, bees aren't even indigenous to North America. But bees suffering today is really entirely a part of sort of the global marketplace. The mites were introduced from Asia in the 80s. The hive beetles came from Africa a decade ago. All of the issues that bees have are through the process of bees being trucked around the country and other products. The hive beetles will also go to certain types of fruit. So they no doubt came over on a ship full of fruit and got introduced to our colonies here. So back in the day, when I was a kid, and Jake said the same thing, when I was a kid, you could have the bees out on the fence row, and if you wanted some honey, you could go get it, and if you didn't want it, you didn't have to mess with them. They'd be there next year. Occasionally they would swarm and wouldn't requeen, and a colony would die off, but it wouldn't be long before another swarm would move in that hive. So back in the day, bees could sort of take care of themselves, but now you got to be a beekeeper. I'll tell you, before I wrap up, the story of how, as an adult, I got started keeping bees. We got our first house on Porter Road, and I went to my dad and said, hey, you got an old hive out in the barn I can have? He goes, oh, yeah, going out there and get you one. So I was going out there and drug out a hive, and I painted it and put it in my backyard, and it was real pretty, and I thought, well, one of these days I'm going to have to get some bees to put in there. I was working nights, and I looked out in the yard one afternoon, and the sky was full of bees. And the swarm came and told me it was time to get started. So I called Kelly's immediately to get some foundation because the frames in there were empty. And those bees would have made the biggest mess. And I had to get foundation in there so that they would have something to build on. So yeah, you've got to have a hive ready for the swarms pretty quickly. One thing I will say about swarms, they are ready to draw out foundation because that's how they function. They go, say, to a hollow tree, and they're starting from scratch. They're going to have to start building that comb from nothing. So they're ready. They're full of honey. They're ready to build wax, and draw that foundation out. So it's a great opportunity, even once you've gotten established and you've got lots of drawn comb, put them on foundation because they'll draw it out fast. And drawn out comb is very valuable to a beekeeper. It's a lot easier to get a colony started on drawn comb than it is foundation.
What is foundation? I'm sorry. The difference between that.
Thank you. Today, tonight, tomorrow, do not hesitate to ask glossary questions because I'll just rattle off this stuff like everybody knows what I'm talking about. Foundation is the thin sheet of wax that you put in the frame, just like you saw me trying to jab that frame in there. Just the thin sheet of wax, the foundation that the bees build on. Then bees create the wax. And the company, the factory, takes that wax and presses it into that foundation, which actually has the impression of a standard honeycomb size on it. And then they start drawing it out. And this is confusing too. You're going to hear people today and tomorrow talk about drawn comb and drone comb, comb for drones. So pay close attention and you'll pick up on that. But yeah, just the thin sheet of wax that we give them to start drawing.
And you have to buy that. I think that's
Yeah, you have to buy that. Yeah, you might be able to buy some contraption where you can make your own, but I would. My dad used to say that all these beekeepers that are cleaning out old frames and putting new foundation in, he goes, you know how much a new frame costs? I wouldn't sit around. You'll spend more time trying to get all the junk out of an old frame than you will just nailing a new frame together. He never understood that. He said, just burn that old frame, put a new one in there. One more question. All right, good. Thanks for your attention. I appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed the class.